Pacing. It's the most important thing a dungeon master can master. Forget character voices, combat balancing, or anything else. Pacing is what turns good DMs into great DMs. But when I say pacing, you and I are probably thinking of two very different ideas. So, let's discuss what pacing is, what it's not, and how you can master pacing in your own D&D campaigns. Pacing, in the context of Dungeons & Dragons, is the speed in which a group of players moves through a story, questline, or D&D world. It is not just when a story beat happens. Tabletop RPGs are their own unique form of storytelling and therefore have different tenets. First, let's break down pacing into two different types, story and non-story pacing. Let's discuss non-story pacing first because it is by far the most important on a session-to-session basis. Non-story pacing encompasses the way a dungeon master runs their session. When a dungeon master chooses to add in a combat encounter during a traveling scene, that impacts non-story pacing. It is the choice a dungeon master makes to roleplay a shopping trip or simply asking the question, what is your character trying to buy? When and how you call for a die roll can involve non-story pacing. Have you ever had a moment when you're trying to roleplay an encounter but your DM keeps asking for die rolls and the party loses their enthusiasm? In those moments, the pacing of the session has been affected. As a DM, you control everything about the world, what quests are available, the way things happen, etc. Even in sandbox campaigns, the DM is the filter in which the players experience the world. Even the most hands-off DM is still responsible for the pacing of a D&D campaign. You still ask the questions like, will there be an encounter in this room in a dungeon, or will you roleplay travel or skip it altogether? The question of pacing haunts the decision-making of every dungeon master. So, non-story pacing impacts the feel of your session. It is involved in every type of D&D adventure, from story-heavy campaigns to the freest sandboxes. Now, the question remains, how do we refine non-story pacing? Well, the answer is quite simple. We must balance two different elements, engagement and verisimilitude. Let's break those two things down. Engagement is the focus your players have on the game or overall story. High engagement looks like your players paying attention to when NPCs talk, encouraging other players during combat, or just talking about the game out of session. Low engagement is harder to pin down because every party is different, but average signs of low engagement are not paying attention in combat, not caring about the story, or a player being on their phone the entire session. Now, player engagement is a whole other video in and of itself, but the short and nuanced way to build player engagement is to find what a player finds fun about your game and do more of that. However, we have to balance this impulse with verisimilitude. But what is this big word? Well, verisimilitude is the realism and believability of your D&D world. It is the atmosphere that you weave around your game. If one of your players has ever said that your world feels like a real place, then your game has high verisimilitude. We as dungeon masters build verisimilitude by adding in believable consequences, challenges, and world activity. When your players rob a shopkeeper, you would expect that the town guard would come for them. If they're trekking across a desert, the party might run out of water. The two countries that have been on the verge of war eventually going to war shows that your world has other events happening in it. Things like this build verisimilitude. But having lots of verisimilitude and your game feeling realistic doesn't make your game good. Sometimes tracking every piece of ammunition detracts from your game. Trying to only focus on engagement also isn't sustainable. Without a bit of realism to ground your story, you lose the challenge that will keep your players coming back session after session. Realism would say that a hidden tomb would be filled with traps. However, if there are traps around every corner, then your players will become less engaged. It'll be a foregone conclusion that they will eventually hit a trap and take damage. Therefore, as a dungeon master, we must find a happy medium. The best advice I can give you for how to do this is to simply watch your players closely. Read how they're talking, their body language, and how they talk in and out of game. If you find that your players are both engaged and interacting with your game world as if it was real, then you're probably striking a happy balance. Just make sure to watch out for activities that can bring your pacing to a halt. A few notable candidates for this are endless random encounters, needlessly hostile NPCs that will not cooperate with the party, or pointless quest objectives. The last one is by far the worst, and I don't see it talked about nearly enough. This is when you head over to an NPC for information and they tell you to go collect 4 rat tails before they give you the information. It's pointless. Now, most DMs have their NPCs do something a bit more complex, but this still happens. Streamline the amount of stuff that your D&D party has to do, not things to build the plot, roleplay moments for the character, or heck, even downtime activities. I'm only talking about random fluff here. And look, every D&D adventure has fluff. It's just a matter of how much. Also, if you're trying to tell me in the comments that your D&D adventure has zero fluff, then newsflash, you have fluff. And it's probably a lot of fluff. You're just too narcissistic to realize it. Non-story pacing comes down to DM choice. As a DM, you have to recognize that you are in control of the world. You are the filter in which the players experience everything. Just because you have something written down on paper doesn't make it reality. It's only what the players experience that is reality. So yes, you might have 15 rooms left in the dungeon, but if your players are completely gassed and it seems like they don't want to go and run through your dungeon crawl any longer, take the high road. Acknowledge that maybe you might have mismanaged this encounter or this dungeon and just skip it. Maybe your players are just ready to leave the city, so don't make it a big deal about getting wagons and horses and things along that nature. It's a 15-second sentence and one player paying some gold and they're gone. It's these decisions that impact the pacing of a D&D session and heck campaign the most. So I encourage all DMs to balance engagement with verisimilitude. Make your D&D world realistic, yes, but also weigh it against player enjoyment. But okay, we've talked a lot about non-story pacing, and I think now it's time to discuss story pacing in D&D campaigns. I've said it many times on this channel, but tabletop RPGs are a new narrative medium. You cannot treat pacing in a D&D game the same as pacing in a book or movie. Story pacing, in this context, refers to the number of plot points in a D&D campaign and when those plot points happen. Since D&D is a collaborative storytelling game, these plot points change, morph, and sometimes are scrapped altogether. However, this does not mean that pacing within a D&D game doesn't follow a structure. If you want to learn that basic structure, I've actually already covered plot building in this video right here. So check it out if you haven't already, but we're going to build on that. Because you see, different genres of games have different pacing. For example, let's say you're running a noir game. This type of pacing is slow overall as you're going and finding clues and mysteries, but it picks up towards the end as you begin to unravel the mystery and put together all the clues. Think a pulp detective movie. What about something from the action genre? Well, these types of games are constantly moving with moments of very high plot progression. Think a Marvel movie. There's always something happening to advance the plot in a Marvel movie, but there are these certain scenes or fights that move through 20 to 30% of the plot in a given chunk. Think of a Thanos fight in one of the Avengers movies. And one final example, epic adventure. Epic adventures are slow moving, with moments of zero plot progression, as you're just going throughout this epic fantasy world, but it has high progression towards the end. Think Lord of the Rings. In the final hour of the movie, we have two final battles, a Dark Lord being destroyed, a ring being thrown into lava, characters dying. It's crazy. But at other points in, let's say, Return of the King, it's slower moving. But no matter the genre, it's important to understand that in all of these genres, they rely on this concept of tension and release. Tension is the build-up to an event, while the release is a satisfying conclusion. If your party is on a quest to save a kidnapped princess, the tension comes from fighting your way through the stronghold to the princess, and then the release is killing the dragon that was hinted at along the way. You build the tension up for this fight and will release it with the encounter. But don't get me wrong, this has nuances. Firstly, tension degrades over time. There's a critical point where you can no longer build tension. Your players are at their maximum. It is during these times that you must release the tension. Sometimes this comes in the form of just cutting plot points. If your party is ready to release the tension and you cannot build it up anymore, why spend another 2 sessions getting ready for your boss fight? End the session at the boss fight. It does not make sense to bloat your story. I know it's hard, but you have to kill your darlings. You might have a fantastic character that you want your party to meet, but they won't care. They want to kill the dragon. The longer you wait, the less awesome it will be. So don't be afraid to cut away plot points. Secondly, you need to be releasing less tension the farther you go in the story. You beat the mini-boss, but ... By doing this, you create a climax for your campaign. That way, when you reach your last plot point and release the tension, it feels like an ending, and endings are important. So as your campaign continues, DMs out there, always add a but at the end of your plot points. Yes, you saved the princess from the dragon, but I already got her magical blood to build my death ray. The party might have won, but they won 90%, and the villain won 10%. Then we increase this ratio to 80-20, 70-30 until the very end. Try seeing if your own campaigns fit this model. Your villains need to be scary and intimidating, but you also don't want to TPK the party. So having this split victory and not releasing the tension all the way really helps in many different narrative fronts. It is also vital to remember to pick a time frame and stick to it when you are running a campaign. A time frame is a general session length. You might say 30 to 40 sessions, or you might say I'm ending this campaign come next November. Once I do this, I then create an outline to keep track of when these story beats are happening. That lets me see what storylines or character arcs I haven't touched in a while. Even if you run sessions weekly, 4 sessions is a long time to go without touching a narrative plot point. Because think about it, the real world happens. Your players aren't living this campaign world or its story or its characters in the same way that you are as a dungeon master. Things get forgotten. 4 sessions might be the equivalent of 4 weeks or heck 4 months for some parties. Therefore, I found it better to keep track of events in real world time instead of in-game time. Because, oh man, if a party hasn't experienced a storyline in 3 months, how am I supposed to get them to remember or care? That tension is gone from that storyline. Sure, it might have only been 3 or 4 sessions, but that can still be a long time. You cannot expect players to reliably remember something if it's been a month or 2 since you last brought it up. You'll at least need a refresher or something to help them along. And look, here's another harsh reality. D&D campaigns fall apart. That's the reality of the hobby. A majority of campaign games don't make it past 6 sessions. Most don't make it past 5th level. I could really make a video out of this entire concept, but don't hold all your cool ideas back until the very end of the campaign. Unleash your cool ideas early and often. Therefore, unless you are 99% sure that your campaign is making it long term, don't wait forever. Look at your outline, insert your plot points, and get on with your story. Simple. And by this point, you probably have questions or comments, and I'm guessing a big one is going to be about railroading. This entire video spawned out of my first Critical Role video. In that video, I shared my thoughts about what I thought was poor pacing at the end of Campaign 2. And if you thought the pacing was great, more power to you. But the important thing is that many people confused pacing with railroading, and any talk of pacing to be about railroading. I personally find this disastrous for the hobby, and it struck me to my very core. If you watch this video, hopefully you know that they are not the same, but I am making a video where I will explicitly go over the differences between pacing and railroading. Leave your questions in the comments down below, and I will answer them in the next video. Otherwise, check out this video if you want to learn how to create a sandbox campaign, and thank you for entering the dungeon.